All right, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This is Lynn O'Hara from NHD checking in. This is the third of four webinars in the series, Silent Heroes, Untold Stories from the Korean War. We are so lucky to be working with Dr. Lesh Melnick and the National Cemetery Administration on this grant program with all of you to uncover some amazing stories. So in order to get going today, a couple quick reminders. You kind of know the drill at this point. This is 3 of 4, but teachers, Google Classroom is emailing you right now that your webinar is late. It's not late. It's okay. We'll get it scored. We'll get it in there. We have the Q&A box open. We also have captioning turned on. If it's helpful to you, leave it on. If it's distracting, hit the live CC button. You can toggle it on and off. Just like always, we have the survey at the end for attendance credit. That's really helpful for us. Not only does it let us know who definitely was here, but it gives us feedback that we use. And I can tell you, I will send the feedback first, the initial feedback, and then the final feedback to our team. And we use that to shape what we're doing in the next month and in the next years of the program. As always, we'll post the slides. We'll post the video link tomorrow to Google Classroom. Where we're at, oh, there's a typo in there. I hate when I do that. Your veteran organizers, not your home front organizers, are what is due this Friday. Sorry about that. Make sure teachers hit that mark is done button. That lets you research mentor. You're good to go. And the last module is, in terms of research, is going to launch on Friday, where we focus on military experience. All right. Last piece I'm going to mention, teachers. I know many of you have been working with my colleague Jamie Hollifield this week to go ahead and get those cemetery visits scheduled for the spring. So just a reminder, download a copy of that packet, read the instructions. Life is always easier after you read the instructions, even if you're somebody like me who's like, I can put it together without the instructions. Trust us, read the instructions. Life is easier. Pick 2 dates. Pick your primary date, pick your backup date. And then when you're ready, have Jamie connect you with your cemetery director, confirm those dates, and then there's a form that we ask you to fill out once you have confirmed dates with NHD. That lets us make sure that we're communicating properly with all the parties involved. And that means that maybe we might be able to get a visitor out to see you or to meet you and your students, depending on where you are. If you need help or have questions in the process, James taking the lead in this effort, please reach out at any time. She's a wonderful resource and happy to work with you. All right, at that point, I'm going to pause and turn things over to Dr. Melnick to say hello to you and a quick greeting from the NCA, because he had some audio issues the last time, but you know, it happens to all of us.
I appreciate it. I've been here even if I haven't been able to vocalize. Some of the people who know me say that's a good thing, but this is now the 4th time. Really excited to watch these lectures. Dr. Hamner, I always learn something, even though I've been studying military history for decades now. So you're really getting a treat here. And I am getting more and more excited to see the research that teachers, you and your students are going to uncover. We had out at the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, we had our first group of students going out and giving video eulogies. Lynn had the difficult task of going out to Hawaii in order to be there and witness that and address them. And I am hoping for the opportunity myself this spring to join one of your groups when you go to a national cemetery and see the eulogies that your students have researched and deliver. I'm really happy with everything I've seen from National History Day. Lynn, you and your team have done remarkable work in introducing students to our nation's veterans. That's the whole goal of this Veterans Legacy Program, and it really is a pleasure to see it unfold here. Working with you to find military documents for students to examine, and working with teachers to help connect the national cemeteries. It's been my pleasure and my delight. So without any further ado, I'm here to help answer questions at the end, but the next hour or so is Dr. Hamner's to enlighten us and perhaps even entertain a little.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Lynn, can you give me a thumbs up and just let me know that you can see the slide? Fantastic.
Good to go.
Great. I am going to see if we can get this working. Fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us again. I don't know where you are, what the weather is like where you are, but I am in Arlington in Northern Virginia, and it is cold and rainy, and the wind is beating against the outside window panes, and it feels like a great night to be sitting inside, kind of cozy and learning some more things about the Korean conflict in the 1950s. My grad school advisor would have called this good history weather. So I want to start things by just, touching base very quickly with some of the ideas that we talked about in the first two webinars, and then we'll talk about the three things we want to get into tonight. But one of the first things I want to revisit really briefly is the material that we covered about race and racism in the first two webinars. And I went over really carefully about the feedback from the first and second webinars. And I want to just make sure that the point that I was trying to get across comes clearly. So the reason that we revisit some of these moments in American history and some of the primary sources that go with them that can be painful is not to make the United States look like a bad country, or a country that's filled with a lot of racist, irredeemably racist people. Um, I think the reason that we look at this history in its fullness is to get a deeper, richer understanding of the background that our silent heroes are coming out of in the Korean War, the kind of world that they've grown up in. And while it's true that the United States in the 1930s, 1940s exhibits a lot of behavior that's racist and kind of difficult to look at, it's also a country that produces people, Japanese Americans, Black Americans, and others who, despite having grown up in situations in which their government didn't always treat them as equals, were nonetheless willing to wear the uniform and serve, often with distinction. So it's a country that has some racist elements present, but it's also a country that's capable of producing citizens who overcome those elements and go on to fight for it. So I think it's not that the United States is a bad country, but that the United States is a complicated country. And for me as a historian, that's what we really want to roll up our sleeves and dig into, is the complexity of a moment. And rather than reduce it to simple binaries of this is good, this is bad, just the richness of it. It's a country that had a lot of racist tendencies in the 30s and 40s, but also produced people who were willing to go out and serve. And I think that's kind of remarkable. Where we left things in the previous webinar was a sort of geopolitical consideration of the early years of the Cold War and the situation that set the stage for the conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We talked a lot about the early Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, the very public-facing promise to support freedom-seeking peoples anywhere in the world, NSC 68, which was a top secret, highly classified document internal to the Truman administration that discussed the ways in which American national security was linked to combating the spread of Soviet communism. So we've got a kind of public-facing part, a very private, classified part. But remember that the Truman Doctrine represents a really dramatic break from 100 and some years of American foreign policy that says American national security is inseparably linked to the freedom struggles of people everywhere in the world. Truman is speaking in particular about Greece and Turkey, but the Truman Doctrine of containing communism and supporting free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities, that has a sort of global reach to it. And it really sets the stage for the early part of the Cold War and the sense that comes across in this political cartoon that we looked at, that the United States and the Soviet Union are kind of staring each other down in a titanic struggle between two ideologies. And Korea becomes one of the flashpoints where that ideological struggle erupts into a much more military hot war. So we're going to finally get to the war itself tonight. We've got an interesting mix of great primary sources, some newspaper headlines, some soldiers' letters, some political cartoons, a grab bag of everything. And since doing things in threes seems to have worked pretty well, I propose that we repeat that structure tonight. So we're going to do three things in our hour. One is a kind of operational history of the Korean War. So I'm going to throw a few maps at you, a little bit of red and blue arrows, but not too much, because I think that beyond a certain point, that can actually obscure what we're trying to understand about the soldiers' experience. But in order to appreciate what is happening to the service members that we're tracking on the ground, I think it's good to have a general working understanding of what is happening and where and when in the war. So that'll be our first thing. The second thing we're going to look at is the perspective of the rank and file soldiers on the ground. And as you'll see, that almost always looks dramatically different than this bird's eye perspective. The red and blue arrows on the map can be useful to get your bearings and to understand a kind of chronological storyline. But for the average soldier on the ground, their experience of war rarely resembles that bird's eye view. That's one of the things that I am constantly reminded of in my career studying the soldiers' experience on the ground, that mile-high view often bears little or no resemblance to the way that soldiers are experiencing on the ground. And we're going to dig into a couple letters and see what the soldiers themselves are responding to. That'll be our second thing. And then our third thing is to look a little bit more deeply at some of the big technological changes that occur during the Korean War, particularly as relates to military medicine and battlefield medical treatment. And that's going to give us a chance to talk a little bit more about the presence of women in the Korean era armed forces, because so much of the medical support is provided by women in the nursing corps. So we'll do three things tonight. We'll start with a little bit of the operational history of the war. And I've got four maps here. There's actually a fifth one that I'll stick in completely for free as we get between November of 1950 and January of 1951. But let's get started all the way here in the summer of 1950. So we left off in our second webinar talking about how the sort of lines had been drawn, a public American commitment to aid free peoples as they attempted to resist subjugation, and a sense that this was an open-ended commitment, that it was something the United States would, at least on paper, agree to support anywhere, that it was in the United States' own national interest to support those struggles. But as it actually played out on the front pages of newspapers and in the halls of power, it was not always clear if the United States was willing or even able to defend everywhere all the time. And it's an open question in January and February of 1950 whether the United States would actually honor the promises in the Truman Doctrine and be willing to go to war in a place like the Korean Peninsula should it come to military conflict. The then Secretary of State Dean Acheson had made some public statements that could be interpreted as kind of wavering on this commitment. Remarks to the extent that, peoples would be responsible for their own defense, that the United States would not furnish blank checks everywhere. There's a little bit of equivocation, and Stalin in Moscow appears to have kind of interpreted that as not quite an invitation, but an opening, perhaps. In the post-World War II settlement, the United States and the Soviet Union had divided the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel and had indicated a willingness or a desire to see the peninsula reunited politically, although it wasn't exactly sure, or it wasn't stipulated how that might happen. the Americans took over the southern part of the Korean Peninsula and indicated that they were willing to hold democratic elections. The northern part of the Korean Peninsula, which is supported by Stalin's Russia, does not rush to hold those elections. The United States, out of frustration, submitted that the Russian refusal to hold elections to the United Nations General Council to get some sort of a ruling. In the interim, on June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops, with the blessing and the assistance of Soviet military advisors, began pouring across the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion of the southern part of the peninsula. It was a shocking development. Here we have the UN resolution, Resolution 83, issued 2 days later on June 27th, 1950. And you can see that the sort of outrage expressed that the armed attack upon the Republic of Korea by forces from North Korea constitutes a breach of the peace. The UN calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, a withdrawal of the North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel. In the final paragraph, it offers the recommendation that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. It's adopted at the meeting, 7 votes to 1. Yugoslavia is the lone dissenter. And before you ask why Yugoslavia dissents, I don't know yet. I'm looking into that. In the interim, though, the North Korean invasion rolls down across the peninsula, captures the capital at Seoul, and Americans back in San Francisco and Cincinnati and Albany, New York, are reading about the sudden and swift conquest of most of the Korean Peninsula by communist North Korean invaders. We'll see in the summer of 1950 a variety of different responses, both responses within the United States and from the UN General Assembly at large. And there were a couple of questions in our previous webinar about what the UN response is. So let's dig in. Tonight's the night. Here we've got an image that is circulated in summer of 1950. And I'm going to throw this one out to you guys in the audience. So let's take a look at this image and start with just kind of what stands out to you in the text and what kind of details in the artwork get your attention. And I'd love to kind of put a bunch of those on the table. I spent a half an hour looking at a bunch of different details in this when I first turned it up. So there's a lot going on there. Once we've got some details on the table, let's think a little bit about what the emotional mood of the poster is. What if you see this in the summer of 1950, what kinds of feelings is it trying to stir in you? So I'm going to throw that one open to you guys. Tell me what you see.
I think it's really important too, when you get to one of these, slow down and look at all of it. Because sometimes we see like the first thing, like stop criminal, right? We see that first, that it's meant to draw our eye. And that's an important detail, but there's lots of important details here.
And just to underline Ms. O'Hara's observation, that lesson to slow down is one I think we all need. Students, instructors, I have to keep reminding myself of that because often you want to just jump ahead. I will tell my students in class, like, let's tap the brakes. Like, let's not jump into what we think we know. Let's do a little slower job of cataloging and noticing, because that gives you those sort of raw materials that you can harness to make insights.
All right, Mrs. Turner, looks like we've got some answers coming in.
Yep, we have some answers coming in. So one of our attendees said the giant UN hand coming out to grab the communist aggressor who is attacking the Republic of Korea. Another one commented, dripping blood from the weapon in the communist aggressor's hand. That image incites fear. That's
a great one. And even though I looked at this image for 30 minutes, I did not notice until you mentioned it. So that club is just really horrific. It seems to have spikes hanging off it. And yeah, there are
Mhm.
little blood droplets. I mean, it's a particularly kind of barbaric image there.
Another commenter, the different flags stood out. Yet another one, interesting that it says communist aggressors, not North Korea, indicative of the conception of monolithic communism.
All commies are the same, right? And all commies are bad, right?
Fantastic. Yeah,
That's
they all must be working out of the same central headquarters. I think that's a great catch. And also the flags is a great observation. And let's push it further. I mean, why have this big circle and emphasis on 53 United Nations? Like, what is the emotional effect of that?
Someone else went a step further with the flags, so I'll read that. The flags and people all racing towards the communist fight in the center shows how this is a global battle, specifically the detail in the people from their clothing to stances.
Mhm.
Boy, there's another one I missed, but you're quite right. Like every little figure is dressed in sort of the stereotypical garb of that country, I think, or some effort to do it. So I see like the Australian flag has got a boonie cap and shorts, and there's Uncle Sam. There's the British flag has like a top hat and tails.
A lot of people were noticing the flags of the UN.
I think
The
there's a
word
couple observations here about, the Republic of Korea being a person who's been beaten very badly. So you're running to someone's defense in a dangerous situation.
Yeah, and I think there's something else there. I'm just kind of looking at the composition there at the center, right? So we've got this kind of large, kind of, semi-barbaric communist aggressor character. And then bludgeoning the Republic of Korea, which looks a little bit weak and is beaten. You can see there's blood on the scalp, and it looks like the communist aggressor is ready to take another swing at somebody who's already crumpled on the ground. So there's a kind of viciousness in the center there that I think is really designed to get you angry, or to fan the flames of righteous indignation. And the 53 countries all rushing to this figure's aid, this sense of like power and unity, that it's not just, the United States that is defending the Republic of Korea, but, it is all of the civilized countries of the world are rushing to the defense. And you notice that they, in the about halfway through in the text there, the communist war makers will be stopped, underlined, right? There's no question that this effort is going to succeed. And then I thought it was interesting that they have this in the midst of this kind of violent sequence of communist aggressors viciously beating a weakened figure and this ring of people closing. That the text there at the bottom, through the United Nations peace, right? That the whole function of this still pretty new organization is to try to restore peace. And I think the big text at the top, stop criminal, this underlines this idea that this is an act of aggression. We have learned the lesson, in 1950 of the Second World War, that this kind of aggression of nations invading other nations is illegal and has to be stopped through force. So we've got kind of a lot of things condensed and focused into one simple seeming on the surface image. So that's great. We're going to do at least one more political cartoon later in the presentation. But what we see between June 25th, 1950 and the middle of September is the invading North Korean army capturing Seoul and pushing back the defenders all the way back to the very southeastern part of the peninsula. The United Nations, in passing its resolution to oppose this invasion, also recognizes that the United States is going to play the most important role as the most powerful nation, the wealthiest nation, the nation with the largest military presence, that the United States will anchor and lead this effort. And so by mid-September, we see South Korean forces and American troops pulled almost all the way back to the southeastern corner of the Korean Peninsula around the port city of Busan. And that becomes known, the outline there, as the Busan perimeter, which is what American troops will be defending in autumn of 1950. Here we have a picture of the American troops defending that perimeter. And this is a kind of fighting that Americans knew how to do from their experience in World War II. So in some ways, the fighting that we're going to look at tonight in the Korean conflict, it feels familiar enough to American military leaders and to American veterans. This is conventional fighting, in the countryside, using infantry, using armor, using artillery. This is something that Americans have had some experience in the not too recent past doing. And so they are able to dig in and hold the Busan perimeter into autumn of 1950. November of 1950, we'll see a dramatic swing in the fortunes of war. The American commander Douglas MacArthur devises a risky but brilliant plan, rather than to fight all the way back from the Busan perimeter, to land an amphibious force at Incheon, so about halfway up the Korean Peninsula, and that is behind the lines that are currently held by the North Koreans. So this is a risky operation, but it is one that has the potential for a high payoff if Americans can successfully land at Incheon and then fight their way inland to cut off some of the invading troops. And again, this is a kind of fighting that Americans have some experience doing in the Second World War, both in Europe in 1944 at D-Day and in the Pacific. American planners know how to land troops and military equipment and supply lines. The landings at Incheon are a spectacular military success. And they wind up landing troops in the rear areas of the North Korean invaders. So if you are looking at the newspapers in autumn of 1950, you are seeing great headlines trumpeting the military success of these landings. We need to squeeze in one more map that is not in this 4-map sequence, because there is one more big reversal of fortune that comes in late November of 1950. And that is a massive counterattack supported by the Chinese that will result in pushing the American and UN forces all the way back south of the 38th parallel. And so the Americans in September landed in Incheon. They are able to push the North Koreans almost all the way back to the Yalu River, and then the pendulum swings again. And it's this period of fighting that involves the famous struggle at the Chosin Reservoir, soldiers who are struggling not just against the enemy, but against the conditions, brutal winters. And you have stories emerging from the soldiers who fought there in the end of 1950 of just heroic levels of sacrifice to just keep the units together. What we get for the next 2.5 years is a kind of stalemate as the line moves back and forth, but not very much. And peace talks will open and then will languish for months and months and months at a time. And both sides are pushing and trying to achieve some gains, while also acknowledging that at some point the war has to end. It's going to end in some sort of negotiated settlement. That will not come until July of 1953. This is the headline of the Cincinnati Enquirer that announces the truce that ends the war, but there is no surrender. There is no moment where one side acquiesces to the other. And so what we get after years of stalemate is a kind of tense settlement along the 38th parallel line, which still exists today. So that's the Korean War in just a handful of slides. Obviously, we can't go deeply into operations, but I'd be happy to talk with you later or over email if there's a particular part of the Korean War operation that you're interested in. If I don't know it myself, I'm happy to steer you towards somebody who does. One of the things that I am always taken by as anytime I'm teaching operational history or we're talking about lines on maps is how little resemblance that bird's eye view has to the lived experience of the soldiers actually doing the fighting. It's not that the soldiers know less or that they care less about what's happening on the map. So much so is that it's just a radically different experience that the combat soldiers are having. And so I had a chance when this grant opened to kind of dig back into some files and archives and dig up one of my favorite kinds of primary sources, which is just letters, diary entries, and things that are produced by soldiers who are actually on the front lines, who don't have that bird's eye perspective, but who are contending with the lived reality of fighting in a particular place at a particular time. There's some great things that show up in the files. This was the program for a Thanksgiving Day dinner that is from November of 1950, and I was really entertained just to think, first of all, like that the United States military would go to such great lengths to mount a pretty elaborate Thanksgiving Day meal to boost soldiers' morale and to give them at least a little taste of home as they're feeling, isolated and often, very far away from the comforts of the United States. And the
Dr.
prayer
Hamner.
on the left was kind of interesting.
Dr. Hamner, we've
Yes.
got a question pertaining back
Yeah.
to what you were talking about previously in the chat. It says, how did the UN authorize an attack on North Korea if the Soviets had veto power on the Security Council?
That's a really good question. And I would have to double check, but this is a place where there is some tension introduced by the American commander, Douglas MacArthur, who is the military commander who is subservient to the president as commander in chief. But MacArthur, who's a World War II veteran, wants to fight a very aggressive war and is actually interested in chasing the North Koreans across the Yalu River and expanding the war into a larger Asian war. That there's a lot of tension and friction that will erupt between the president and MacArthur. Truman will eventually relieve MacArthur of command. I'd have to go back and check some of the UN files. I'm not sure how at that phase of the war how actively the UN Council is managing strategic decisions like that. But I will go back into the files, and if the person with the question would like to email me directly, I'll get a definitive answer. Thanks.
I think I can offer
It's a great question.
on Sorry,
Yeah.
Les Melnick here. Just to say, in that June 1950 timeframe, it's actually often acknowledged in the histories as a major strategic error on the part of the Soviet Union. They boycotted the key meeting where the vote was made to intervene on the ground in Korea. Had they not boycotted, their veto would have taken effect, and there would have been no UN intervention into Korea. There might still have been American intervention, but not a United Nations one.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's super helpful. And that makes the other piece fit together about, pushing the 53 United Nations, that it's not just an American effort. So it does not stretch credulity to imagine that it would not, that they could have boycotted the UN effort, but there would still be an American military presence. It's not, I'm not sure that even in the absence of UN support, the Americans could have just abandoned the Korean Peninsula. But that falls into that category of what ifs and counterfactuals that we can't know for certain.
Right. And was, I think, a similar effort during the Vietnam War to see if UN forces would serve, but at that time, the Soviet Union had the good sense to make sure they didn't boycott any meetings. And so while the Americans America intervened in Vietnam, and we had allies like Australia and other countries with us in Vietnam. It was not a United Nations effort.
Fantastic. We're also getting like a little window into the complexities of Cold War geopolitics and diplomacy, and also the very new nature of the United Nations, which is a brand new international organization getting its first
Right.
really serious test. The soldiers on the ground, from what I have gleaned, are not necessarily ignorant of those things. It's just they are thinking about other issues. They're thinking about Thanksgiving dinner. They're thinking about families. They're trying to make sense of their own experience that is often, complicated, confusing, often frightening, but just really kind of divorced from the geopolitics. So I want to throw out as a second primary source here a letter that comes from February 20th, 1951. A little tough to read here, so I've excerpted it and blown it up here. We've got an actual, just a regular soldier writing home to a wife and family and describing what he's experienced in the preceding days and weeks. And what I'd like you to do is take a quick skim over it, but be thinking mostly about what surprises you, both kind of what he talks about and maybe what he doesn't talk about. And then think a little bit about the details that stand out to you and why those details might stand out. And the thing I'm always trying to do as a historian who has probably read 30,000 soldiers' letters at this point from various conflicts, is to really immerse myself in how the frontline soldier's experience is different than that sanitized version on a map. There are usually things that are surprising, both in terms of what they talk about and what they don't talk about, that make me go, oh, gosh, that's not what I would have expected someone in January of 1950 or June of 1944 or July 1863 would have been talking about. What can I kind of learn about the soldier's experience by the things that I wasn't expecting? So what have we got here that stands out in terms of, what this soldier is disclosing to wife and family, and what seems to be the first letter for a little, after some time with no letters. And I'm curious, I'll throw that one open to you guys. Ms. O'Hara, Ms. Turner, what's come up in the chat?
Still waiting. Probably going to take a little bit for him to read it.
Okay.
I think though, you got to think of this from two sides. You want to think about the soldier writing the letter, but I think you also want to think about the wife and family receiving the letter. I mean,
Reading it, yeah.
I mean, I just the straight line. I was shot in the right thigh with a single sniper bullet. Like, whoa, that's a big thing.
So, but also, so I love that, Ms. O'Hara. And like, what's the very first line of the letter? Like, I'm wounded and I'm in a hospital in Japan, right? Like the very first thing, I've been shot, but I am okay. That is the immediate news that the soldier desperately and very reasonably wants to convey. The family may have gotten some information from the government, but here's the guy saying, I'm all right. That's the first most urgent thing. Not, you may have heard that the Soviets have boycotted the UN General Council. Like, it's Paul, it's your husband, your son. I'm hurt, but I'm all right.
Well, we got a lot of comments coming in the chat now.
Cool.
And the first four are all about the Chinese medic.
Yes.
And the fact
so what did they say?
they're fighting the
That
Chinese.
my jaw just dropped when I got to that part.
Let's see what else. Somebody wrote about the PS and the cookies.
It's like superhuman, right? Like, just so relatable. Like, the guys that are left would still like some of those cookies, which just doesn't show up on the big red and blue arrow map. We could go back and spend a little more time in that third paragraph, where he talks about, he's been shot in the second paragraph. He's dragged himself 10 yards to some cover, and then he just lays there for a while, and then he sees some guys, what he says, walking, and yells for help, and it turns out that they're Chinese. They are the enemy. And the medic comes, puts a fresh bandage on his leg, puts him in a litter. They carry him into the one house that's still standing. He's got to be freezing. He's lost blood. I mean, this is a very dangerous situation to be in. They make a fire, they cover him up. And he says, "I'm sure what they did for me saved my life," which just struck me as a really interesting little snapshot of, you know, an opponent, the enemy medic comes and saves that renders life-saving aid to this guy, observes the legal convention surrounding war, and it's only afterwards that American patrols come and find him, and then he yells for their help. And then, you know, what he talks about, 5 minutes, I had a drink of water, a morphine shot, a cigarette, and a fresh bandage. Like, there's nothing about, you know, I think the war feels incredibly personal to people who are fighting it on the front line. And so the things that stand out about this is what I felt. It was cold. I was hungry. I was scared. I was tired. I would like some cookies, like very much kind of human details that just really aren't captured in that 30,000-foot view. Anything else in the chat that we might want to?
Yeah, somebody noted that it just seems very matter of fact, despite the intense experiences. Like sort of
Yeah.
just rattling off a series of things that are like really, really big things, and it's just very kind of matter of fact.
I've seen that in so many of these kinds of letters that people will relate harrowing or terrifying or you know, really intense experiences, but just do it as they're kind of narrating things and like giving the family some sort of factual you know, story of how they got to where they are. But I love the bookend here of, you know, it starts out by saying, "I am okay. I've been shot, but I'm in the hospital in Japan." And then the last thing, like, we would not be upset about cookies. Like, just very kind of human elements. And you see those things, you know, throughout soldiers' correspondence. I think not just Americans in Korea, but Americans in all wars. And as near as I can figure, just Americans or just, you know, soldiers in all wars, being on the ground, being close to where the fighting is happening, really narrows people's intention, and it narrows kind of the world that they care about. So there is less concern about, you know, big strategic happenings and more focus on the right here. I found a great collection of letters. Yeah.
One more comment that someone brought up, that they in their research had found that many of the letters were censored that were sent home. And it was
Yes.
just interesting to them that this didn't seem to be censored at all. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
This one is not censored, as far as I can tell. Because so this is the original. We get the original facsimile version. I think in this case it's because the person writing the letter is an officer, and officers did the censoring and were trusted in a way that the enlisted personnel were not to self-censor their own letters, which is just one more thing that enlisted personnel found kind of obnoxious about their relationship with officers. So I'll go back and I'll check my file where I got this, but I think that's the explanation here. So this person, Kenneth Zill, is just writing like regular letters to the woman that he's courting and who he will eventually marry. And there's the same kind of stuff here. It's kind of matter of fact, this is where we are. We're on a hill overlooking a valley. They're on one side, we're on the other side. We control the valley in the daytime. They control it by night. You know, there's a sense of boredom punctuated by terror. You know, we sat here for 27 hours and then, you know, you're scared at night. Just this sense of the sort of unreality of being at war. You know, you're sitting and doing nothing for a while, and then you are in one of the most intense experiences imaginable, afraid for your life and trying to focus on the job that you have to do. And then in the last couple of lines, like shifts right back to that sort of matter of fact, like I don't have your mailing address in Florida. I'm hoping to have it. And then, very human and kind of profound expressions of, I love you, I miss you, people reaching out for connection that I think is often intensified when they're at or near the front lines of combat. The other thing that comes across, and you may have seen it in some of your research, is the incredibly miserable conditions that are present in the Korean Peninsula, which has very cold winters and often like really punishingly hot summers. And so the soldiers are often talking not just about the enemy soldiers that they're fighting, but also the way that they're kind of at war with the environment. And in the winter of 1950, 1951, that is particularly acute. The Americans who are fighting the Chosin Reservoir, this is in many places they have not gotten adequate winter gear, adequate winter clothing. A lot of the soldiers and Marines are wearing their summer uniforms because this is not a war that America was expecting to happen at this moment. And so there's a sense in a lot of the correspondence that I've found about talking about the misery of the elements, of being exposed, of not having the right kind of gear or enough of it. But this is a kind of fighting that is not unfamiliar to the American military. I mean, these are conventional operations against a near peer conventional opponent. And so in some ways, the photographs are reminiscent of some of the things that Army photographers produced in 1944, 1945, the freezing winter landscape at Chosin Reservoir in black and white looks a little bit like the frozen landscape in the Ardennes forest at the Battle of the Bulge. There's a couple of ways in which the Korean conflict diverges very noticeably from the way the Americans fought the Second World War, the previous conflict. And we've already talked about these. Like there will be Black troops in the combat arms, and as a result of Truman's executive order, a fully desegregated military. So we've got soldiers of different races serving in the same units, and this is a photograph that you would not have seen in 1945. So here we are in 1950 at the Busan perimeter. A world has changed in half a decade, and we're getting larger groups of different ethnic backgrounds fighting in the war in Korea. We've got here a picture of the 65th Infantry Regiment, which is composed of Puerto Ricans. 90% are volunteers, and in this case serve as a whole unit that is overwhelmingly Puerto Rican, has a lot of white mainland officers, but establishes a distinguished fighting record. We've got 100,000 Mexican American soldiers in the military. Like we are seeing participation among a broader cross section of the American population than we had previously. And there's a little time in Q&A we can go more deeply into some of these elements. I came across this telegram as I was pulling together some primary sources, and I found this interesting in a couple of regards. In one sense, it's not an uncommon kind of primary source because, between 1942 and 1953, the federal government sends out hundreds of thousands of telegrams like this one, which is often the first way that a family would learn that a loved one had been wounded or had been captured or had been killed or was missing. And I found this one just interesting in that it is informing the family that their son has been missing in action in Korea since the last day of November 1950. The other thing that gave me pause was just looking at the date it had arrived. You can see it in the upper right-hand corner, 1950, December 25th. And that struck me as like a really difficult telegram to receive on Christmas Day. About a month later to learn that their son has still not been found. One of the other ways in which the fighting in Korea is different than the kind of fighting that characterized the American experience in the Second World War is military medicine, which had seen significant developments even in just the 5 years between 1945 and 1950. So we'll talk a little bit about new ideas about treating battlefield casualties, but I want to underline the importance of women in providing medical care and medical support in Korea. This is not the first time that women had served in the nursing corps. In fact, there's a large presence in both of the world wars, but women are going to turn out and serve in the Korean conflict in even greater numbers and in slightly different ways than they would have in preceding conflicts. Remember that women are not allowed to serve in the combat arms, and it will be 60 more years before that prohibition is lifted. But women are going to come out and join the military and serve often very near the front lines in their capacity as nurses. One of the big things that changes between 1945, the end of the Second World War in Europe, and 1950, the beginning of the war in Korea, is new approaches about how to treat people who have been wounded in combat. And the Korean War will mark the development and deployment of the mobile army surgical hospitals, or the MASH units, which become famous in the popular memory as well. And you can see in the next couple of slides what is happening in terms of medical care close to the front lines. And the signal change here is an appreciation that the closer you can the sooner that very seriously wounded soldiers can receive medical care, the greater their likelihood of survival. And the idea is to push the surgical hospitals, places where soldiers can get seen by a trauma surgeon in an actual operating room, as close to the front lines as possible, and then to use new technologies whenever possible, like the helicopter, to bring soldiers from the front line of the battlefield back to the surgical hospital. This is a really dramatic change in the approach to providing medical care in the military. It's just not possible in 1945. It's the advent of the helicopter that helps this, but also the realization that the first 60 minutes after someone is seriously wounded are disproportionately significant in their kind of long-term survival odds. Trauma doctors now refer to the golden hour, the first hour after a traumatic experience, a gunshot wound, in which the value of medical intervention is really high. If you can get to somebody in that hour, their chances of survival go up really dramatically. And so in the MASH units, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, there is this Herculean effort to make trauma ORs portable enough that they can be pushed from rear areas where they would have been in the Second World War up much more close to the front line of battle, so that you can start seeing soldiers and have them operated on within that hour whenever possible. And so we're seeing in the development of the MASH units, we're seeing women who are in their capacity as nurses, not combatants, but they are being moved much closer to the front. So they are getting much closer to where the fighting is done. I read in multiple books that there are not established cases of women who are so close to the front that they're actually hurt or killed by the fighting, but we're seeing the hospital parts of the military moved much closer to the front, and the result is incredibly dramatic. So if you can get a wounded soldier to a MASH unit, there's something like a 97% survival rate, which is spectacular and represents a massive improvement over the same kinds of wounds just 5 years earlier. So this is a Herculean effort, but one that pays, incredible dividends to American soldiers who've been wounded in the fighting. All of these changes don't manage to break the stalemate, though, and the stalemate of the Korean fight from the beginning, from early 1951 until the summer of 1953 is mostly characterized by stalemate. And so let's, for our last primary source, I pulled out this political cartoon that's coming from 1952. And I want you to do the same kind of exercise that we've been doing. So like, let's think about what the details are, what stands out. And then once you've got a couple of ideas there, take one quick step back to think about what's the emotional tone? What's the mood? What kind of feelings do you think the artist is trying to evoke in the reader? Is it, and here you can play word association. You can just lay out a couple of emotions. What this makes me feel, fill in the blank. And let's see if we can get a sense of how Americans at home are experiencing this stalemate phase of the Korean conflict.
I think that's a really interesting point, because in a democracy, the opinion of the American public has a weight. Right? Because
An
if you don't
incredibly
like,
important one. Yeah, and an incredibly important one. George C. Marshall, who was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the Second World War and is, considered the architect of American victory, said early in that war, he said, you cannot expect a democracy to fight a 7 years war. People do not have the patience for kind of open-ended sacrifice. We need to fight this war, and we need to fight it to a successful conclusion, rather than let the enemy kind of draw out attacks on our patience. And the Korean conflict doesn't last as long, but I'm starting to see some sense here of a kind of, well, I'll leave it to you guys.
Well, we have a few answers in the chat. So one says the cartoonist feels that the UN is getting nowhere closer to peace between peace between Korea. Another one said it's interesting that peace is out of reach, and no matter what the UN does, it is going to keep moving further out of reach. Someone
Yeah, and let's pause on that one real quick. Like, I think, so we've got this kind of pile of like boulders and rocks in the front, which are worth thinking about what those are. But also your commenter just now about peace is out of reach, and it's always going to be out of reach because the bird cage is attached to the UN service member. And so like as they're crawling along, the further they crawl, peace is going to still stay frustratingly right out of reach, right? That's just the nature of the system as the artist portrays it. And that's a great cat.
Some other things that are coming up: frustration, futility, desperation.
there's a lot of comments about the road being rocky or being broken, that you can't just pass through it or crawl through it. Like, it's basically an impossible task in different ways.
Yeah, an impossible task, and they're kind of labeled like all the different varieties of obstacles, like the, expenses, world apathy, mounting casualties. Like, this is hard going, and it's a goal that you can never reach. The more he crawls, the bird cage is always gonna be that far away. And I hope somebody has noticed the title of the cartoon, which is kind of easy to overlook because it's sort of penciled in italics at the top, but probably also worth a little bit of analysis.
We also, what else did we have in here? Tired, pessimism.
Yeah, weariness, fatigue, pessimism. You get a sense of just frustration, maybe bordering on disillusionment about where this is going. I mean, this is, the war has been going on at this point for let's say 2 years, and doesn't seem to be moving towards resolution or victory. And there's a sense, I think, of disillusionment, maybe, that this has turned out to be really hard. The road is rocky and it's going nowhere. And one of the things, if we noticed earlier, a distinction between the operational perspective of the war, where we're looking down from 30,000 feet at a map and blue and red arrows, and the lived experience of the war on the front line, and we saw there's often a pretty big disconnect there. I think we could see a kind of similar disconnect often between the war as experienced by the people who are fighting it and the war as understood by the people who are just reading about it at home. And often there's an equally big chasm between frontline soldiers and the rest of the country who's learning about the conflict secondhand, third hand, in a highly kind of filtered version that they're getting through the government and from news sources. And we'll turn our attention to that kind of domestic response in our fourth webinar. And so let me hand things back to Lynn with the last slide and survey, and then I will stay on along with the rest of the team and do as much Q&A as we can.
Great. Well, thank you. That was a good webinar. We've got lots of different ideas and sources and documents. I love these because as much as you think you know after a while, like you realize like, oh, I've never heard of that, or I've never seen that before. And that's the joy. Historical research really gets you down to that. All right, we're at our hour point. We understand if you have to go. We do ask that you please do your survey. So either use your phone, scan that QR code, or tinyurl.com/nhd-kw-live. Get it? NHD, Korean War Live. But we know I think there might be one or two questions in the queue, and we'd love to take questions. We're happy to take questions about the content tonight, the war, service members' experience. If you have questions about your research or where you're going, we're happy to take those too. And if you have questions about the National Cemetery Administration and things maybe you've learned about your cemetery or your community, we'll do our best to answer those as well. So do we have any questions in the queue ready to go?
We do. We have one question right now. It says, how would you compare and contrast the approach made by Truman to that which was made by Eisenhower? Why the difference?
That's a really good question. I've actually got a note in my file to look into that a little bit more for a different class that I'm teaching. There is some continuity in that there is a kind of broad adoption of the Truman Doctrine and the idea that the Americans need to resist and be seen to resist fighting. So I don't think there is ever a serious concern that the Eisenhower administration is going to like abandon the effort in Korea. I think one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that Eisenhower is himself a very experienced military leader, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Second World War, and had a post-war career that took him to like the presidency of Columbia University. Eisenhower comes into the presidency with a sort of insider's understanding of the military and a little bit of skepticism, not about the Korean War effort, but about just the amount of money that the United States was spending on its military in general. And so I think that, Eisenhower was able to speak out against what he came to call the military industrial complex with the sort of authority of somebody who had spent most of his adult career in that system. And Eisenhower is also balancing a number of other kind of foreign policy issues at the same time as the Korean conflict. So during the Eisenhower administration, for example, there will be a massive overhaul in the way the United States uses its growing nuclear arsenal as a sort of threat to back up what it can and can't do in conventional terms. So I think in general, there's a lot of continuity in terms of, that the Korean conflict, the conflict on the peninsula can't be abandoned wholesale, but also that the United States cannot pour infinite resources in there. Eisenhower is balancing concerns about meeting Soviet challenges in Europe. And so this is, what can we accomplish at a cost that the American people are willing to pay. And I'm going to dig back into the book that I'm reading for my graduate seminar and see what else I can get kind of more fine-grained. One of the things that I'm constantly coming back to in the Korean War conflict is Truman's relief of MacArthur, which is a national news item because MacArthur is a American folk hero of the Second World War. And, Truman relieves him of command for being too belligerent and for being, for kind of challenging the chain of command in the Korean Peninsula. That is a problem Eisenhower does not inherit.
Can I throw out a
All right.
teacher way to think about this?
Oh, please.
And I'm going to credit my high school teacher with this one. The one thing that she taught us to always think about was when we're talking about these big scale things, whether we're talking about war or diplomacy or, these big events that, because our presidents change over every 4 years or every 8 years, that often the president who's dealing with the issue is really dealing with decisions made by the previous president. So Eisenhower really inherits the legacy of Truman and the decisions, good, bad, or indifferent, that he made. Because oftentimes this isn't like we do something today and we see the reaction tomorrow. We actually see the reaction several months or years later. So I think that's always good to keep in mind, because I think we like to either give the president blame or credit for things. And sometimes it's things that they have control and decision-making authority over. And I think a lot of times, more and more, we realize with these kind of issues, they kind of are dealing with the situation that's put in front of them, not necessarily the one that they would want to create or use.
Yeah, these are, in many ways, these are kind of legacy issues. And so Eisenhower inherits the Truman Doctrine. Eisenhower is going to be distracted, by the middle of the 1950s with things that are happening in another place Americans can't find on a map called Vietnam. Like these are issues that he will inherit, and that in the case of Vietnam, he will pass on to the next president in succession. So it's very rare for a president to come into a completely blank slate. You're taking on ownership of the previous president's decisions and the context.
All right, Mrs. O'Hara, we have a question, a logistical question that I think might be a good one for the rest of the people that are on to hear. It says, is it okay to use social media to reach out to our veterans family? I can't find an email, but found the daughter-in-law on Facebook.
Yes, there are ways to do it. A couple things to consider if you're going to reach out via social media. First off, make sure, number one, an adult is doing it. Obviously not a student, but I'm sure you know that. I think the key, if you're going to reach out, is to provide contact information for you. So, give a little explanation. My name is, I teach at this school. We've been doing research on this person who I believe might be your father or grandfather or uncle. And then what you would want to give them a way to contact you, either on or off Facebook. So you might say, this is my school email, this is my school phone number. One thing we found is that families have different levels of receptiveness, right? There's some family members, I know some of you have made contact, who are thrilled and excited and going to meet with students or meet with teachers and share lots of things. There are others who might be reluctant for one of 1,000 different reasons. And either way, it's okay. They might want to talk about it and they might know lots of things and have lots of things. They also might be at a point where they don't want to, or they can't, or it's too painful. Keep in mind, many of these veterans died relatively recently, right? Some died in the 1970s or 80s, but some died within the last year or two. So just be open to either response and know that either response is okay. But yes, it's absolutely okay. It's worth a shot. We've had luck through phone calls. We've had luck through emails. We've had luck through putting an ad in a local newspaper. You never know how it's going to work. But
Tell me more about that. Jeez.
I know a teacher has one out right now, so we'll see if it works.
Wow.
But sometimes
I admire the resourcefulness.
Well, think about different community forums, right? So sometimes it's like a high school alumni group, or sometimes it's a VFW post, or, sometimes you get just one good post out there, and you can try a direct message. You can also put the post out and see if people who know people might be able or willing to share in that community. There's no right or wrong way. And I would say if you don't put it out, you don't get anything. But you never know what one thing can lead to. But just make sure that any activity like that is led by the adult in charge. That's all we ask. Great question. All right, well, it looks like we're coming to the end of our Q&A for the evening. So I'm going to go ahead and say a very, very big thank you. Thanks, Dr. Hammer, for another great webinar. Thanks, Dr. Melnick, for jumping in and adding a little Soviet diplomacy history. Thanks, Mrs. Turner, for all your help with running the Q&A and all of the things that you're working on behind the scenes to make this happen. We are thrilled and excited for the direction this research is going. Remember, by Friday, turn in your veteran experience. We'll flip everything over and get it ready. Military experience will launch. That's our last research module. And then we'll work on starting to put the pieces together and write our eulogies and visit the cemeteries and build the profiles. For the students who are still listening, remember, you're going to be published authors this time next year, and that's really exciting. Know that the work you do pays off, and this really matters. I'm going to share one quick thing as we wrap tonight. When I was in Hawaii, one of the students' parents, who is also a chaplain in a hospice, came. And he said he was so impressed by the students and their work, it was going to change the way that he led services at this cemetery for families. Because I think, we have to keep this in mind, that when you put in good work and you put your heart into this, there's, you'd be amazed what you can teach a lot of people, even the adults around you. So thank you for all of your help. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here. Good night, all. Have a wonderful day.